Sometimes, the smallest, most helpless creatures teach us the biggest lessons about what we're willing to fight for. The trembling beagle puppy that old Pete Morrison carried into Dr. Marla Jennings' clinic that Tuesday morning looked like it. At being through hell, the little dog's coat was covered in angry sores from severe mange. Dr. Jennings had seen plenty of neglected animals in her 3 years practicing in Cedar Falls. But something felt different about this case. The puppy's condition didn't respond to any treatment. In fact, it seemed to get worse. Strange growths appeared overnight. The blood work showed things that made no medical sense. When Marla started asking questions about where Pete found the Mange dog, she discovered a trail that led back to a closed laboratory, a lab her own father had once worked for. What had her father been involved in that could do this to an innocent animal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Falls had always been the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, and most folks preferred it that way. The main street still boasted the same red brick buildings that had housed the town's commerce for over a century. Their painted signs weathered but proud. Miller's Hardware sat next to Betty's Diner, which neighbored the post office where Mrs. Henderson had sorted mail for 37 years. It was the sort of community where a handshake still meant something, where people left their doors unlocked, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the annual harvest festival. Dr. Marla Jennings had returned to this sanctuary 3 years ago, fresh from veterinary school at State University, carrying student loans that felt heavier than her diploma. She'd taken over the practice from old Dr. Patterson, who'd been treating the town's animals since before she was born. The transition hadn't been entirely smooth. Some of the older farmers still asked when the real doc would be back, but Marla had earned their respect through late night emergencies and a gentle way with both animals and their worried owners. The Cedar Falls Veterinary Clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its wraparound porch now serving as a waiting area where nervous pet owners could pace while their companions received care. Marla had kept most of Dr. Patterson's old equipment, partly out of necessity and partly out of respect for the man who'd inspired her childhood dream of becoming a veterinarian. The examination room still smelled of antiseptic and hope, a combination that had comforted her as a young girl when she'd brought injured strays to Dr. Patterson's kind hands. Her father, Dr. Robert Jennings, had been different from Dr. Patterson in almost every way. Where Patterson was warm and approachable, Robert had been intense and driven, a man who saw the world through the lens of scientific inquiry. He'd worked as the town's only human physician until his death in a car accident when Marla was 16, laws that had shaped her in ways she was still discovering. Robert had always encouraged her love of animals, often saying that veterinary medicine was the purest form of healing because animals couldn't lie about their symptoms or complicate treatment with psychological barriers. Animals tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen, he told her countless times. They don't have hidden agendas or ulterior motives. What you see is what you get. Sarah Chun had become Marla's lifeline in those early days of practice. Hired as a veterinary assistant straight out of the local community college, Sarah possessed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that complemented Marla's medical training. At 28, she was only 3 years younger than Marla, but her easygoing nature and quick wit had helped bridge the gap between the new doctor and the community's initial skepticism. Sarah's family had moved to Cedar Falls when she was 10, and she understood what it meant to be an outsider trying to find acceptance. The clinic's daily rhythm had become as familiar as breathing. Morning rounds started at 7, checking on any overnight patients before the first appointments arrived. Tuesdays were typically busy with routine vaccinations and checkups, the kind of predictable work that kept the lights on and paid down student loans. Marla had just finished examining Mrs. Peterson's arthritic German Shepherd when she heard Pete Morrison's truck rumbling up the gravel drive. Pete was one of those fixtures every small town seemed to have, a weathered man in his 70s who could fix anything mechanical and knew everyone's history going back 3 generations. He'd been her father's friend, one of the few people who'd attended Robert's sparsely attended funeral. Pete had a soft spot for strays, often bringing injured animals he'd found on his property or during his work around town. His truck, a rust-colored Ford from the Clinton administration, was as much a part of the landscape as the courthouse clock tower. But when Pete climbed down from his cab that Tuesday morning, his usual stoic demeanor had cracked. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached into the truck bed for a cardboard box lined with old towels. The sound coming from inside the box was heartbreaking, a weak whimper that spoke of pain and confusion. "Found this little one?" "Near the old Jean Dine place," Pete said, his voice rougher than usual. "Been caring for her about a week, but she's getting worse instead of better." Marla's breath caught in her throat as she peered into the box. The beagle puppy couldn't have been more than 6 months old, but her coat told a story of suffering that no young animal should endure. The mange had ravaged her fur, leaving patches of raw, weeping skin that looked almost burned. But there was something else, something that made Marla's trained eye narrow with concern. The pattern of the sores wasn't typical of any mange she'd encountered in her studies or practice. "How long did you say you've been caring for?" Marla asked, gently lifting the puppy from the box. The little dog's eyes large and brown and filled with a trust that broke. Marla's heart tracked her movements with surprising alertness despite her obvious distress. "About a week," Pete repeated, his calloused hands twisting the brim of his worn baseball cap. "Started treating her with the usual remedies, but nothing seems to help. If anything, she's gotten worse." Sarah appeared at Marla's shoulder, her face immediately softening at the sight of the puppy. "Oh, you poor little thing," she murmured, her voice carrying the gentleness that made her so effective with frightened animals. "Let's get you comfortable." They moved to examination room 2, the largest of the clinic's 3 treatment spaces. Marla's hands worked with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, examining the lesions, noting the puppy's overall condition. The little dog's temperature was elevated, but not dangerously so. Her heart rate was fast but steady. What troubled Marla were the lesions themselves. They had an almost crystalline quality at the edges, as if the tissue was mineralizing in a way that defied normal biological processes. "Pete, you said you found her near the old Jean Dine building?" Marla asked, trying to keep her voice casual while she collected samples of the affected tissue. "That place has been closed for, 15 years now?" Pete's expression grew. "Guarded. About that, yeah. Place gives me the creeps, to be honest. But I do some maintenance work for the county, checking on abandoned properties to make sure kids aren't getting into trouble. Found her in the parking lot, like she'd been dropped off. Jean Dine Laboratories." The name stirred memories Marla had tried to keep buried. She remembered her father mentioning the facility occasionally, usually in passing references to consulting work he'd done there. It had been a small biotechnology company, the kind of operation that Cedar Falls had hoped would bring jobs and prestige to their rural community. Instead, it had closed suddenly, leaving behind nothing but questions and an empty building that had become a source of local speculation and teenage dares. After Pete left with promises to check back on the puppy's progress, Marla found herself staring at the tissue samples she'd collected. Something about this case felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with standard veterinary protocols. The puppy, whom Sarah had already started calling Hope, despite Marla's protests about naming patients, was responding to their initial treatment, but slowly, as if her body was fighting against its own healing processes. That evening, after Sarah had gone home and the clinic had grown quiet except for the soft sounds of their few overnight patients, Marla made her way to the basement storage area. Dr. Patterson had used the space to store old medical journals, outdated equipment, and files dating back decades. Somewhere in that organized chaos, she hoped to find references to unusual skin conditions or anything that might shed light on Hope's mysterious ailment. What she found instead was a leather-bound journal she'd never seen before, wedged between boxes of vaccination records from the 1990s. Her father's name was embossed in fading gold letters on the cover. Dr. Robert Jennings, research notes. Marla's hands shook as she opened the journal. Her father's precise handwriting filled page after page with observations, hypotheses, and detailed drawings of cellular structures she didn't recognize. Most troubling were the recurring references to something called Project Lazarus and notes about enhanced cellular regeneration protocols. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before her father's death, made her blood run cold. The Gendyne trials have exceeded all parameters, but not in ways we anticipated. The subjects show remarkable healing capabilities, but at a cost that may not be acceptable. I've expressed concerns to the project directors, but they seem more interested in military applications than medical ethics. If they proceed with the current protocols, the implications could be devastating. The next entry was even more disturbing. I cannot in good conscience continue this work. The cellular modifications are causing unpredictable mutations in test subjects. What we're creating isn't healing. It's a fundamental alteration of biological processes that we don't fully understand. I've decided to document everything and present my concerns to the proper authorities. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. Marla closed the journal, her mind reeling. Her father had never mentioned this research to her, never hinted at any involvement with genetic experimentation. She'd always known him as a careful, ethical physician who put his patients' welfare above all else. But these notes suggested a side of his work she'd never imagined, and raised questions about his sudden death that she'd never thought to ask. Hope whimpered from her kennel in the recovery room, drawing Marla back to the present crisis. Whatever her father had been involved in 15 years ago, it might hold the key to understanding the puppy's condition. But as she looked at the journal in her hands, Marla couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something that others had killed to keep secret. The clinic's old radiator clanked to life, filling the quiet space with familiar sounds of settling metal and circulating water. Outside, Cedar Falls slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, its residents secure in the belief that their small town was safe from the kinds of dangers that plagued the outside world. But sitting in the basement of the veterinary clinic, surrounded by decades of medical history and holding her father's hidden research, Dr. Marla Jennings was beginning to understand that some secrets ran deeper than anyone in Cedar Falls had ever imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clinic's examination table as Marla carefully removed Hope's collar for a more thorough cleaning. The puppy had spent a restless night, her condition seeming to fluctuate between improvement and deterioration in ways that defied medical logic. Sarah had arrived early, bringing coffee and the kind of quiet concern that spoke of sleepless worry. "How is she?" Sarah asked, setting down 2 steaming mugs on the counter away from the medical equipment. "Stable, but puzzling," Marla replied, her fingers working along the worn leather of Hope's collar. The accessory was clearly handmade, probably by someone with more affection than skill. But as she examined it more closely, she noticed something. A slight thickness in one section that didn't match the rest of the leather. "There's something here," she murmured, using a small scalpel to carefully separate what appeared to be a false section of the collar. Hidden inside was a small brass key, tarnished with age but clearly functional. Etched into the metal was a logo she recognized, Gendyne Laboratories. Sarah moved closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "That's from the old lab, isn't it? The one that closed down?" Marla nodded, turning the key over in her palm. It was warm from being pressed against Hope's neck, and she could feel the weight of its implications. Pete said he found her near the Gendine building. This suggests she didn't just wander there, she came from there. The decision to visit the abandoned facility felt both inevitable and terrifying. Cedar Falls wasn't the kind of place where people went exploring abandoned buildings without good reason, and Marla had plenty of reasons to avoid stirring up memories of her father's final months. But Hope's condition was worsening again, and the journal entries she discovered the night before suggested that Gendine held answers she desperately needed. Sarah volunteered to accompany her, but Marla declined. Whatever she might find at the abandoned laboratory, she preferred to face it alone, at least initially. Some discoveries were too personal to share, and she suspected this might be one of them. The drive to Gendine took her through the older part of Cedar Falls, past farmhouses where she'd made emergency calls, and fields where she'd chased escaped livestock. The laboratory sat on 20 acres of what had once been prime agricultural land, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the rural landscape surrounding it. The building itself was larger than she remembered, a sprawling complex of interconnected structures that had been designed to house significant research operations. The main gate stood open, its electronic locks long since disabled by time and weather. Warning signs posted by the county declared the property unsafe for entry, but Marla noticed that the grass around the buildings had been recently mowed, and the parking lot was relatively free of debris, signs that someone had been maintaining the property despite its supposed abandonment. The key Pete had hidden in Hope's collar fit perfectly into a side entrance marked "Research Personnel Only." The door opened with surprising ease, revealing a corridor that stretched into the building's interior. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows along the walls, suggesting that power was still connected despite the facility's official closure. Marla's footsteps echoed off polished concrete floors as she explored room after room of abandoned research space. Most had been stripped of equipment, but she could see outlines on the walls where expensive machinery had once been mounted. Computer terminals sat dark and empty, their screens reflecting her flashlight beam like dead eyes thought it was in. The building's basement level that she found what she was looking for and what she wished she hadn't. A series of rooms clearly designed for animal housing stretched along one corridor, each equipped with specialized cages and monitoring equipment. The metalwork bore scratches and dents that spoke of desperate animals trying to escape their confinement. But it was the final room that made her stomach turn. Unlike the others, this space hadn't been completely stripped of equipment. Examination tables fitted with restraints stood ready for use, and cabinets still held supplies that hadn't been deemed worth removing. The floors bore stains that looked disturbingly organic, and the air carried a faint chemical odor that made her eyes water. On one of the examination tables, she found a partial stack of laboratory records that had somehow escaped the facilities. Evacuation. The papers were water-damaged and difficult to read, but she could make out references to canine test subjects and genetic modification trials. One document bore her father's signature as a consulting veterinarian, dated just 2 months before his death. The most disturbing discovery came in a locked cabinet that opened with the same key she'd found in Hope's collar. Inside were dozens of photographs documenting the progression of experiments on various animals. The images showed creatures in various stages of genetic modification, their bodies displaying growths and alterations that looked remarkably similar to what she was seeing in Hope. But these weren't the controlled, ethical experiments she'd studied in veterinary school. The animals in the photographs showed signs of distress and suffering that no legitimate research facility would have tolerated. Their eyes held the same haunted quality she'd seen in Hope, a look of confusion and betrayal that spoke of trust. Violated Dot as she photographed the documents with her phone. Marla heard footsteps above her. Someone else was in the building. She quickly gathered the papers she could carry and made her way back toward the exit, her heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and terror. The footsteps followed her movement through the building, staying roughly parallel to her route but never quite intersecting. She reached her car without incident, but as she drove away from Jeanine, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The rearview mirror revealed nothing but empty road, but her father's research notes had mentioned that some discoveries were too dangerous to pursue. She was beginning to understand what he'd meant. Back at the clinic, Hope's condition had deteriorated significantly in her absence. The puppy's temperature had spiked, and new growths had appeared along her spine, crystalline structures that pulsed with their own rhythm. Sarah had managed to stabilize her with 4 fluids and antibiotics, but it was clear that conventional veterinary medicine was inadequate for whatever Hope was experiencing. "Where have you been?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. She started, "Declining about an hour after you left, and nothing I've tried seems to help." Marla shared what she'd discovered at Jeanine, watching Sarah's expression shift from concern to horror as the implications became clear. The photographs and documents painted a picture of illegal experimentation that went far beyond anything either of them had imagined. If Hope was a survivor of those experiments, her condition might be the result of genetic modifications that were never meant to be sustainable. "We need to contact the authorities," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The FBI, the state, police, someone who can investigate this properly." "With what evidence?" Marla replied, gesturing toward the water-damaged documents. "These papers are 15 years old, and we have no proof that Hope's condition is connected to the experiments. All we have are suspicions and a sick puppy." As if summoned by their conversation, Hope lifted her head from her bedding and looked directly at Marla. The puppy's eyes held an intelligence that seemed far beyond her apparent age. And for a moment, Marla felt as if Hope was trying to communicate something urgent and important. Then the puppy convulsed, her small body racked with seizures that no amount of medical intervention could control. The crystalline growths along her spine began to glow with a faint pulsing light that seemed to respond to her heartbeat. Whatever had been done to her at Jeanine was reaching a critical phase, and Marla realized she was running out of time to find answers. The key to Hope's survival and to understanding what had really happened at Jeanine Laboratories lay buried in the past her father had tried so desperately to expose. But as she watched the puppy struggle against forces that conventional medicine couldn't address, Marla understood that uncovering the truth would require her to risk everything. Her father had died trying to protect. The veterinary college's emergency hotline connected Marla to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a former pathology professor and one of the few people she trusted with unusual cases. After describing Hope's symptoms and the bizarre crystalline growths, she waded through a long pause that spoke volumes about her mentor's concern. "Marla, what you're describing doesn't match any known pathology," Dr. Morrison said finally. "The cellular structures you're seeing, the geometric patterns in the tissue samples, they suggest some kind of artificial intervention at the genetic level. Have you considered that this might not be a natural disease process?" The conversation confirmed Marla's worst fears. Hope wasn't suffering from conventional mange or any recognized veterinary condition. She was the victim of something far more sinister, something that connected directly to the research her father had been involved with at Jeanine. After the call ended, Marla spent the afternoon researching Jeanine Laboratories online, diving deeper into the company's history than she'd ever attempted before. What she found painted a picture of a biotechnology firm with ambitious goals and questionable ethics. The company had been founded by Dr. Marcus Webb, a researcher whose previous work had been plagued by accusations of cutting corners and ignoring safety protocols. More disturbing were the financial records she managed to access through public databases. Jeanine had received significant funding from defense contractors and had maintained relationships with several military research facilities. The company's stated mission of developing advanced medical treatments seemed to be secondary to more secretive projects that weren't clearly defined in their public filings. But it was the discovery of payment records that truly chilled her. Among the recipients of regular consulting fees was her father, Dr. Robert Jennings. The amounts were substantial, far more than a small-town physician would normally earn from part-time consulting work. The payments had continued right up until the month of his death, suggesting that his involvement with Gene had been more significant than she'd ever realized. Even more troubling were other names on the payment lists. Mayor Tom Bradley had received monthly payments labeled as community liaison fees. The county sheriff's office had been compensated for security consulting. Several prominent business owners in Cedar Falls appeared to have been on Gene's payroll in various capacities. The pattern suggested a systematic effort to buy silence and cooperation from the town's leadership. If Gene had been conducting illegal experiments, they'd clearly invested heavily in ensuring that local authorities would look the other way. The web of complicity extended far deeper into Cedar Falls than Marla had imagined possible. Her research was interrupted by Pete Morrison's unexpected return to the clinic. The old handyman looked even more troubled than he had the previous morning. His weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed to have deepened overnight. "Doc, I need to tell you something about that puppy," he said, removing his cap and twisting it between his hands. "I wasn't completely honest yesterday about where I found her." Marla looked up from her computer, noting the guilt in Pete's expression. "What do you mean?" "I've been caring for strays near the Gene place for years," Pete admitted. "Not just that one puppy. There's been dozens of them over time. Dogs, cats, even some wildlife that showed up with strange conditions. Most of them didn't survive long, but I kept trying to help the ones I could." The revelation hit Marla like a physical blow. If Pete had been encountering affected animals for years, it meant Gene's experiments had continued long after the facility's supposed closure. The abandoned laboratory she'd visited might not be as abandoned as it appeared. "Pete, why didn't you tell anyone about this before? Why didn't you report it to the authorities?" The old man's expression grew even more troubled. "Because the authorities already knew. Doc, I tried talking to Sheriff Williams about it maybe 10 years ago, when I found a whole litter of kittens with the same kind of problems. He told me to mind my own business and suggested I might be better off forgetting what I'd seen." Pete reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope filled with photographs. "I didn't forget, though. I documented every animal I found, hoping someday someone would be able to help them. Most of the pictures aren't pretty, but they show the progression of whatever's affecting these creatures. The photographs were heartbreaking. They documented years of animal suffering, showing creatures in various stages of the same genetic modifications that were affecting hope. The images revealed a timeline of ongoing experimentation that stretched back at least a decade, long after Gene was supposed to have ceased operations. "There's something else," Pete continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The puppy you're treating, she wasn't just found near Gene. She was left in a crate by the side of the road with a note attached. The note said, 'Help her if you can.'" He handed Marla a crumpled piece of paper bearing a brief message, written in shaky handwriting. "This is what they did to us. Someone needs to know the truth. Help her if you can. She's the last one." The implications were staggering. Hope hadn't been a random victim or escaped test subject. She'd been deliberately placed where Pete would find her by someone who wanted the truth about Gene's experiments to be discovered. The person who'd left her had known about Pete's history of caring for affected animals and had trusted him to bring hope to the only veterinarian in town. But who had left the note? And what did they mean by "she's the last one"? As if responding to their conversation, Hope began whimpering from her kennel. When Marla checked on her, she found that the puppy's condition had changed again. The crystalline growths were more pronounced, but they no longer seemed to be causing her pain. Instead, Hope appeared more alert than she'd been since arriving at the clinic, her eyes bright and focused with what looked almost like anticipation. "She's trying to tell us something," Pete observed, watching Hope's behavior with the intuition of someone who'd spent decades working with animals. "Look at how she keeps looking toward the window facing Jeandyne. It's like she knows something's about to happen." Before Marla could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Dr. Jennings, this is Mayor Bradley. I think we need to have a conversation about your recent activities. There are some concerns in the community about you stirring up old troubles that are better left buried. Why don't you stop by my office first thing tomorrow morning? I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings about your role in this community." The call ended before Marla could respond, but the message was clear. Her investigation into Jeandyne hadn't gone unnoticed, and the same network of complicity that had covered up the experiments for 15 years was mobilizing to protect their secrets once again. That evening, after Sarah had gone home and the clinic had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Marla found herself drawn back to her father's study. The room had remained largely untouched since his death, preserved by her mother as a shrine to his memory before she'd moved to Florida to live with her sister. When Marla had returned to take over the veterinary practice, she'd inherited the house along with its ghosts. The study still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco and the leather-bound medical journals that lined the walls. His massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface organized with the same precision he brought to his medical practice. But it was the old answering machine in the corner that caught her attention, a relic from the days before cell phones and digital voicemail that no one had bothered to replace. The machine's message light blinked steadily, indicating unplayed messages that had been waiting for 15 years. Marla had never thought to check it, assuming that any important calls would have been forwarded or that the messages would be too old to matter. But given what she discovered about her father's involvement with Jeandyne, she realized that those final messages might contain crucial information. With trembling fingers, she pressed the play button and listened to her father's voice from beyond the grave. Most of the messages were routine appointment confirmations, pharmacy notifications, calls from colleagues that had long since been resolved by his death. But the final message, recorded just hours before his fatal car accident, made her sink into his old leather chair with shock. "Robert, this is Jim Patterson from the family law office. I got your message about needing to meet urgently, and I've prepared the documents you requested. The whistleblower protections you asked about are solid, and I've set up the secure communication channels you wanted. I have to say, though, what you've described about the Jeandyne experiments sounds incredibly dangerous. Are you certain you want to proceed with exposing this? Once you contact the federal authorities, there's no going back. Call me first thing in the morning, and we'll finalize everything." The message was followed by the electronic timestamp. Tuesday, October 15th, 11:47 p.m. Her father had died Wednesday morning on his way to the lawyer's office. Marla's hands shook as she replayed the message, her father's lawyer's words confirming her worst suspicions. Robert Jennings had been preparing to blow the whistle on Jeandyne's illegal experiments. He documented evidence, prepared legal protections, and scheduled a meeting with federal authorities. His death hadn't been a tragic accident. It had been murder, disguised as automotive misfortune. The next morning brought a call from Jim Patterson's son, who'd taken over his father's practice after the elder lawyer's retirement. When Marla explained who she was and what she'd discovered, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Dr. Jennings, I remember your father's case. My father was quite shaken by his death, actually. He'd prepared an extensive package of documents for your father to present to the FBI. But after the accident, someone came to the office claiming to represent your family's interests. They said the documents were no longer needed and offered to handle the disposition of your father's legal affairs. Who came to see him? Marla asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mayor Bradley, actually. He said he was acting on behalf of the family to minimize unnecessary legal complications during your time of grief. My father was uncomfortable with the arrangement, but he was also elderly and wanted to avoid getting involved in what appeared to be a complex federal investigation. The younger Patterson admitted that his father had been paid a substantial sum ostensibly for his legal services, but far more than the work had wanted. The payment had come with a suggestion that the entire matter should be considered closed and that bringing up old investigations would be harmful to the Paws community's reputation. Dr. Jennings, I still have copies of some of those documents. My father kept them in his personal files, I think because he never felt right about the way things were handled. If you'd like to see them, I'd be happy to arrange a meeting. The documents Patterson showed her that afternoon were damning. Her father had compiled evidence of systematic animal abuse, illegal genetic experimentation, and federal contract violations. The research being conducted at Gendyne went far beyond legitimate pharmaceutical development. They were creating biological weapons designed to target specific genetic markers in livestock and food supplies. The military applications were obvious and terrifying. An enemy could potentially destroy a nation's agricultural capacity without traditional warfare, creating famine and economic collapse without firing a shot. The animals suffering in Gendyne's laboratories weren't just test subjects. They were prototypes for a new kind of warfare that violated every international treaty governing biological weapons. But the most disturbing revelation was the scope of the cover-up. The documents showed payments to local officials, law enforcement, and community leaders throughout Cedar Falls. Everyone in positions of authority had been bought off or intimidated into silence. Her father had been planning to expose not just the experiments, but the entire network of corruption that had allowed them to continue. When Marla returned to the clinic, she found Sarah waiting with troubling news. 2 more animals had been brought in with symptoms similar to Hope's farm cat from the Henderson property, and a stray dog that had been hanging around the elementary school. Both showed the same crystalline growths and genetic anomalies that were affecting Hope. "It's spreading," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "Whatever was done at Gendyne, it's not contained to that site anymore. These animals are showing up all over town." The progression of the disease was accelerating. Hope's condition had stabilized somewhat, but the newer victims were showing symptoms that developed much more rapidly. It was as if the genetic modifications were becoming more efficient, more virulent with each generation of affected animals. That evening, as Marla worked late trying to find some treatment protocol that might help the affected animals, she received an anonymous phone call that made her blood run cold. Dr. Jennings. The voice was electronically distorted, impossible to identify. "You're asking questions that got your father killed. Some secrets are worth more than individual lives, and there are people in your community who profit from keeping those secrets buried. Stop your investigation now, or you'll join him." The line went dead, leaving Marla alone in the clinic with 3 sick animals, and the growing certainty that she was fighting forces far more dangerous than she'd imagined. Her father had tried to expose Gendyne's crimes and had paid with his life. Now she faced the same choice. He'd remain silent and watch more animals suffer, or risk everything to bring the truth to light. Outside, Cedar Falls slept peacefully. Under a starlit sky, its residents unaware that their quiet community harbored secrets dark enough to kill for. The return trip to Gendyne felt different this time, charged with purpose and weighted by knowledge that made every shadow seem threatening. Marla had spent the morning ensuring that Hope and the other affected animals were stable before embarking on what she knew might be her most dangerous investigation yet. The anonymous threat from the night before had only strengthened her resolve. Though she couldn't deny the fear that twisted in her stomach like a living thing, the abandoned laboratory looked the same from the outside. But Marla now approached it with the systematic mindset of someone seeking specific answers rather than general information. Her father's research notes had mentioned security systems and documentation protocols, suggesting that evidence of the illegal experiments might still exist somewhere in the facility's infrastructure. The return trip to Jindyne felt different, this time charged with purpose and weighted by knowledge that made every shadow seem threatening. Marla had spent the morning ensuring that Hope and the other affected animals were stable before embarking on what she knew might be her most dangerous investigation yet. The anonymous threat from the night before had only strengthened her resolve. Though she couldn't deny the fear that twisted in her stomach like a living thing, the abandoned laboratory looked the same from the outside. But Marla now approached it with the systematic mindset of someone seeking specific answers rather than general information. Her father's research notes had mentioned security systems and documentation protocols, suggesting that evidence of the illegal experiments might still exist somewhere in the facility's infrastructure. This time, she came prepared with tools: a crowbar borrowed from Pete's workshop, a powerful flashlight, and her phone equipped with a portable battery pack to ensure she could document whatever she found. More importantly, she'd left detailed instructions with Sarah about contacting federal authorities if she didn't return by evening. Whatever happened at Jindyne, the truth wouldn't die with her as it had with her father. The building's security office was located on the second floor, accessible through a stairwell that still bore emergency lighting. The door had been locked, but the crowbar made short work of the aging hardware. Inside, she found banks of monitors that had once displayed feeds from cameras throughout the facility. Most of the equipment was dead, but one system seemed to have maintained power through some kind of backup source. After 20 minutes of experimentation with various switches and controls, Marla managed to access the facility's archived security footage. The digital storage system had been designed for long-term retention, and to her amazement, files dating back 15 years were still accessible. What she found in those files changed her understanding of everything that had happened in Cedar Falls. The footage from October 15th, the night before her father's death, showed him entering the laboratory through the same side door she'd used. But unlike her own cautious exploration, her father had moved through the facility with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The cameras followed his progress to the basement level, where he'd accessed areas she hadn't discovered during her previous visit. What Marla Jennings found in those hidden rooms made Marla cover her mouth in horror. The archived footage showed dozens of animals in various stages of genetic modification. But these weren't the controlled experiments described in legitimate research protocols. The creatures were clearly suffering, their bodies twisted by modifications that served no medical purpose. Some had developed tumors that pulsed with their own bioluminescence. Others showed skeletal deformities that would have made normal movement impossible. But the most disturbing footage showed her father's reaction to what he was witnessing. The man she remembered as calm and methodical was clearly horrified by what Jindyne was doing to these animals. He'd spent hours documenting the experiments with his own camera, his face growing more grim with each discovery. The final sequence of footage showed her father confronting Dr. Marcus Webb, Jindyne's director in the facility's main laboratory. Though the security cameras didn't record audio, the body language of both men made it clear that the conversation was heated. Webb appeared to be making threats while her father held his ground, gesturing toward the evidence he'd collected. Confrontation ended with her father leaving the facility, but not before Webb made a phone call that lasted several minutes. The timestamp showed that her father had left Jindyne at 11:23 p.m., less than 9 hours before his death. Marla's hand shook as she downloaded the footage to her phone. This was the evidence her father had died trying to expose, proof that Dine's experiments had gone far beyond anything that could be justified by legitimate research. The genetic modifications being performed on animals weren't aimed at developing medical treatments. They were creating biological weapons. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Sarah. "Marla, you need to get back here immediately. Hope's condition has changed dramatically, and there's something you need to see." The drive back to Cedar Falls felt like a race against time. Sarah's voice had carried an urgency that suggested Hope's condition had either improved dramatically or deteriorated beyond help. But when Marla arrived at the clinic, she found something she hadn't expected. Hope was sitting upright in her kennel, her eyes bright and alert, and the crystalline growths along her spine were actually glowing with a soft, pulsing light. "It started about an hour ago," Sarah explained, her voice filled with wonder and concern in equal measure. The growths began emitting light, and her vital signs stabilized completely. It's like her body has adapted to whatever was done to her. But Hope's transformation was only part of the story. The tissue samples Marla had sent to an independent laboratory had finally yielded results, and the findings were more disturbing than anything she'd imagined. The synthetic compounds in Hope's bloodstream weren't just genetic modification agents. They were designed to create permanent dependence. The laboratory report detailed how the compounds worked. They enhanced the animal's immune system and healing capabilities dramatically, but only as long as the synthetic agents remained active in their bloodstream. Without regular supplementation, the enhanced systems would collapse, leading to rapid organ failure and death. The creatures subjected to Dine's experiments had been turned into permanent patients, dependent on continued treatment to survive. "It's diabolical," Marla said, reading through the report. They weren't just experimenting on animals. They were creating a captive market. Any nation or organization that used these biological agents would need ongoing supplies of the antidote to keep their own livestock alive. The profit potential was staggering. Dine could release biological weapons that would devastate an enemy's agricultural capacity, then charge enormous sums for the treatments needed to prevent total economic collapse. It was warfare and commerce combined into a single horrifying business model. As Marla processed the implications of her discoveries, her phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Mayor Bradley's office number. "Dr. Jennings, I believe I made myself clear yesterday about the need for you to focus on your veterinary practice rather than stirring up old troubles. I'm calling to inform you that the town council will be reviewing your business license at an emergency meeting tonight. There are concerns about your professional competence and your fitness to serve this community." The threat was clear: stop investigating Dine or lose her license to practice veterinary medicine. But as Marla looked at Hope's glowing form and thought about the other animals suffering from Dine's experiments, she realized that her professional license was a small price to pay for exposing the truth. "Mayor Bradley," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "I think you should know that I've discovered footage of my father's final visit to Dine, along with evidence of the experiments that were conducted there. I'm sure the federal authorities will be very interested in reviewing the town's financial records from 15 years ago." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute before Bradley responded. "Dr. Jennings, I think you're going to find that some secrets in Cedar Falls run deeper than you might imagine. We'll be in touch." As the call ended, Marla realized that she'd just declared war on the entire power structure of her hometown. But looking at Hope's transformed condition and thinking about her father's courage in the face of similar threats, she knew there was no turning back. The emergency town council meeting that Mayor Bradley had threatened never materialized, but the pressure on Marla intensified in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable. Her morning began with the discovery that someone had cut the phone lines to the clinic overnight, and her internet service had been mysteriously discontinued due to what the provider claimed was a billing irregularity. The message was clear: her investigation was making powerful people very uncomfortable. But it was Sarah's revelation that truly shook her understanding of how deep the conspiracy ran. Her assistant arrived at work pale and shaken, carrying a manila envelope that she set on Marla's desk with trembling hands. "My father gave me this last night," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said it was time I knew the truth about why our family never talks about the years right after I graduated high school." The envelope contained bank records and payment receipts spanning several years in the early 2000s. Sarah's father, who worked as a maintenance supervisor for the county, had received monthly payments from Gendyne Laboratories for what the documents described as facility security consulting. The amounts were substantial, far more than a county employee would normally earn from part-time work. He told me that Gendyne paid several families in town to keep quiet about what they saw. Sarah continued, tears forming in her eyes. "Dad said he thought it was just about some kind of pharmaceutical testing that wasn't quite legal, but that it wasn't hurting anyone. He used the money to pay for my college tuition." The revelation explained Sarah's initial reluctance to support Marla's investigation and her family's nervous behavior whenever Gendyne was mentioned. Like so many others in Cedar Falls, they'd been bought off with payments that seemed innocent enough at the time, but had made them complicit in covering up crimes that went far beyond simple regulatory violations. "There's more," Sarah said, reaching into the envelope to pull out a second set of documents. "My father wasn't the only one. He gave me a list of other families who received similar payments. The Hendersons, the Morrisons, even Dr. Patterson before he retired. Gendyne, basically, bought the silence of half the town." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Gendyne hadn't just bribed local officials. They'd systematically purchased the complicity of ordinary citizens throughout Cedar Falls. Anyone who might have witnessed suspicious activity, reported unusual animal deaths, or asked uncomfortable questions had been given financial incentives to look the other way. Marla's investigation had to move quickly now. The clinic's isolation from normal communication channels meant she had limited time to gather evidence before those responsible for the cover-up took more direct action. She sent Sarah home with instructions to stay with relatives in the next county until the situation resolved itself, but her assistant refused to leave. "Dr. Jennings, my family took money to stay quiet while animals suffered," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "I won't compound that mistake by abandoning you now when you're trying to do the right thing." Their conversation was interrupted by Pete Morrison's arrival, but this time he wasn't carrying an injured animal. Instead, he bore a cardboard box filled with photographs, documents, and what appeared to be veterinary medical records dating back more than a decade. "I've been documenting every affected animal I've found since Gendyne supposedly closed," Pete said, setting the box on the examination table. "But there's something I never told you. I wasn't the only one trying to help these creatures. Your father was secretly treating some of them too." The medical records in Pete's box were written in Robert Jennings' familiar handwriting, detailing his attempts to help animals suffering from the same genetic modifications that were affecting Hope. The notes revealed a pattern of experimentation that had continued long after Gendyne's official closure, with affected animals appearing regularly throughout the Cedar Falls area. But the most significant discovery was a series of photographs showing a hidden laboratory that Pete had found in the basement of the old Henderson farmhouse. The pictures revealed sophisticated medical equipment and research apparatus that rivaled anything Marla had seen in veterinary school. This wasn't the improvised setup of amateur researchers. It was a professional facility designed for serious genetic experimentation. "Mr. Henderson died about 5 years ago," Pete explained, "and his widow moved to the nursing home in Millerville. The house has been empty since then, but I've seen lights in the basement windows late at night." Someone's been using that laboratory recently. The implications were clear. Gendyne's experiments hadn't ended with the facility's official closure. They'd simply moved to a more secretive location. The Henderson farm was isolated, accessible by back roads that wouldn't attract attention, and owned by people who were already on Gendyne's payroll. It was the perfect location for continuing illegal research without oversight. As Marla studied the photographs of the hidden laboratory, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Some of the equipment visible in the pictures matched items that had been listed in her father's research notes: specialized genetic sequencing machines and cellular modification devices that he described as being essential to Gendyne's experimental protocols. "Pete, when did you take these photographs?" she asked, hoping the answer wouldn't confirm her worst suspicions. "Last week," he replied. "I've been watching the place since Mrs. Henderson moved out, and the activity has increased dramatically in the past month. It's like whoever's running that laboratory is preparing for something big." The timing couldn't be coincidental. The increased activity at the hidden laboratory corresponded exactly with Hope's appearance in Cedar Falls and the emergence of other affected animals throughout the area. Someone was ramping up the experimentation, possibly preparing for a larger test of the biological weapons that Gendyne had developed. Before Marla could process the full implications of this discovery, her attention was drawn to Hope's kennel. The puppy had been resting quietly all morning, but now she was standing at the front of her enclosure, staring intently toward the window that faced in the direction of the Henderson farm. The crystalline growths along her spine were pulsing more rapidly, as if responding to some signal that only she could detect. "She knows," Pete observed, watching Hope's behavior with the intuition of someone who'd spent decades working with animals. "Whatever's happening at that laboratory, she can sense it from here." As if to confirm Pete's observation, the other affected animals in the clinic began showing similar behavior. The farm cat started pacing restlessly in her kennel, and the stray dog began whimpering with what sounded almost like recognition. All three animals were exhibiting the same focused attention toward the Henderson farm, as if they were being called by something their human caretakers couldn't perceive. "We need to get to that laboratory," Marla said, her voice filled with grim determination. "If someone's preparing to expand these experiments, we might be the only ones who can stop them." The search for her father's missing medical equipment led Marla to the basement of the family home, a space she'd avoided for years because it held too many memories of childhood afternoons spent watching Robert Jennings prepare for his evening house calls. But Hope's deteriorating condition had left her desperate for any resource that might help, and her father's old surgical instruments might prove useful in treating the crystalline growths that CONVENTIONAL medicine couldn't address. The basement was exactly as she remembered it, organized with military precision, every tool in its designated place, every supply carefully labeled and stored. But as she moved aside boxes of old medical journals to reach her father's equipment cabinet, she noticed something that shouldn't have been there, a section of the basement wall that was clearly newer than the rest, painted with a slightly different shade of white that hadn't quite matched after 15 years of aging. Closer inspection revealed that what appeared to be a solid wall was actually a carefully concealed entrance. The bookshelf that stood against it was mounted on hinges, and when Marla applied pressure in the right places, it swung open to reveal a hidden room that took her breath away. Her father had built a complete laboratory in the basement of their family home, not the improvised workspace of an amateur researcher, but a sophisticated facility equipped with genetic sequencing equipment, cellular analysis tools, and pharmaceutical synthesis apparatus that must have cost a fortune. Computer workstations lined one wall, their screens still glowing with data that had been running for 15 years, powered by an independent electrical system that bypassed the house's main circuits. But it was the research notes scattered across the main workbench that revealed the true scope of her father's secret work. Robert Jennings hadn't just been documenting Gendine's illegal experiments. He'd been actively working to develop countermeasures to the biological weapons they were creating. The notes detailed the years of painstaking research into the genetic modifications that Gendine was inflicting on their test subjects. Her father had somehow obtained samples of the synthetic compounds being used in the experiments and had been reverse engineering them to understand their mechanisms of action. Page after page of calculations and chemical formulas showed his progress toward developing what he termed therapeutic interventions for the affected animals. Most remarkably, he'd been close to success. The final entries in his research log, dated just days before his death, indicated that he'd synthesized a compound that could neutralize Gendine's genetic modifications and restore normal cellular function to affected animals. The formula was complex, requiring precise timing and temperature control, but it appeared to be a genuine cure for what Hope and the other animals were experiencing. But her father's research had revealed something even more disturbing than she'd imagined. The genetic modifications being performed by Gendine weren't designed to kill. They were designed to create permanent dependence on continued treatment. The enhanced immune systems and healing capabilities that the synthetic compounds provided would collapse without regular supplementation, ensuring that any population exposed to Gendine's biological weapons would become permanent customers for their pharmaceutical division. "It's not warfare," she read from her father's final notes. "It's the ultimate captive market. They're not trying to destroy enemy populations. They're trying to enslave them economically. A nation that falls victim to these biological agents would be forced to purchase treatments from Gendine indefinitely or watch their people die. The profit potential was astronomical. Gendine could deploy biological weapons that would cripple a nation's agricultural capacity, then charge enormous sums for the treatments needed to restore productivity. It was a business model that combined warfare, medicine, and extortion into a single horrifying enterprise. Her father's computer files revealed that he'd been in contact with federal authorities for months before his death, but his communications had been intercepted by someone with access to sophisticated surveillance equipment. Every email he'd sent, every phone call he'd made to federal agencies had been monitored and reported back to Gendine's leadership. They'd known exactly what he was planning to expose and had been preparing their response accordingly. The most chilling discovery came in a folder labeled Insurance Policy. Her father had suspected that his life was in danger and had prepared a comprehensive evidence package documenting Gendine's crimes. But instead of entrusting it to lawyers or federal authorities who might be compromised, he'd hidden it in the one place he knew would be safe, his own home, protected by his daughter's future need to discover the truth. The evidence package contained everything needed to expose the conspiracy: financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, medical documentation of illegal experiments, correspondence with military contractors seeking biological weapons, and most damning of all, recorded conversations with Gendine executives discussing the deliberate targeting of civilian populations. But the greatest revelation came in her father's personal video message, recorded just hours before his death and addressed directly to Marla. "If you're watching this, it means they succeeded in silencing me before I could expose what Gendine is doing," her father's image said from the computer screen. "But it also means you found the laboratory I built to continue this work. Marla, I know this is a terrible burden to place on you, but you're the only one I trust to finish what I started." The video message explained that her father had chosen veterinary medicine as her career path, not just because of her love for animals, but because he'd known she would eventually encounter the victims of Gendine's experiments. He'd deliberately prepared her to recognize the genetic modifications and understand their implications, even though he'd hoped she would never need to use that knowledge. "The formula is complete," her father continued in the recording. "Everything you need to Synthesize the antidote is in this laboratory. But you must understand, once you begin treating the affected animals, Gene will know that someone has access to my research. They'll come for you just as they came for me. That's why I've prepared additional safeguards. The safeguards included multiple copies of all evidence hidden in locations throughout Cedar Falls, encrypted communication systems that couldn't be intercepted, and most importantly, a network of allies who had been secretly supporting his investigation. The video message included contact information for federal agents who had been investigating Gene independently, journalists who had been researching biological weapons development, and even former Gene employees who'd been waiting 15 years for someone to provide them with protection to testify. As Marla absorbed the magnitude of what her father had prepared for her, Hope's whimpering from upstairs reminded her that time was running out. The puppy's condition was critical, and the other affected animals throughout Cedar Falls were suffering while she uncovered the truth about their torment. But now she had the tools to help them. Her father's laboratory contained everything needed to synthesize the antidote, and his research notes provided detailed instructions for the treatment protocol. The question was whether she had the courage to follow in his footsteps, knowing that doing so would almost certainly put her life in the same danger that had killed him. The answer came as she looked at a framed photograph on her father's workbench, a picture of a young Marla holding a rescued kitten, both of them smiling with the joy that comes from helping a creature in need. Her father had built this laboratory not just to expose Gene crimes, but to ensure that his daughter would have the means to heal the victims of those crimes. "I won't let them down, Dad," she whispered to his photograph, then turned to begin the complex process of synthesizing the cure that could save Hope and countless other animals who had suffered in silence for far too long. The antidote synthesis required 18 hours of continuous monitoring, with temperature adjustments needed every 30 minutes and chemical additions timed to the minute. Marla had never attempted anything so complex, but her father's detailed notes guided her through each step of the process with the precision of a master. Craftsman passing knowledge to his apprentice. Sarah arrived at dawn, bringing coffee and the grim news that more affected animals had appeared throughout Cedar Falls during the night. Mrs. Chun from the grocery store had found 3 cats in her alley, all showing the telltale crystalline growths. The Johnsons' prize bull had developed similar symptoms, threatening the livelihood of one of the county's most successful dairy operations. What had started as an isolated case with Hope was becoming an outbreak that could devastate the entire community. "It's accelerating," Sarah observed, watching Marla adjust the temperature controls on her father's synthesis equipment. "Whatever's causing this, it's spreading faster than before." Marla nodded grimly, her attention split between the delicate chemical process and the growing crisis above ground. "My father's notes mention that the genetic modifications become more virulent over time. Each generation of affected animals becomes a more efficient vector for spreading the synthetic compounds to others." The implications were terrifying. If Gene was deliberately accelerating the spread of their biological weapons, Cedar Falls might be serving as a testing ground for a larger deployment. The town's isolation and the corruption of its leadership made it an ideal location for experimenting with biological agents that could later be used against enemy populations. Pete arrived mid-morning with news that changed everything. He'd spent the night watching the Henderson farm and had observed a convoy of black SUVs arriving at the property around midnight. The vehicles had remained there all night, their occupants moving equipment into the hidden laboratory with the efficiency of a military operation. "These aren't local people," Pete said, his voice tight with concern. "I counted at least 12 individuals, all wearing matching clothing and moving like they've had military training. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon." The timing couldn't be coincidental. Gene operatives had arrived just as the outbreak was accelerating. suggesting that the increasing number of affected animals was part of a deliberate plan rather than an unfortunate accident. The company was preparing for something that would require a larger test population, and Cedar Falls was providing exactly what they needed. Marla's phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, the voice on the other end spoke with the crisp authority of federal law enforcement. "Dr. Jennings, this is Agent Rebecca Martinez with the FBI's Biological Crimes Division. Your father provided us with preliminary information about Gendyne Laboratories before his death, and we've been investigating the company's activities for 15 years. We understand you've been continuing his research." The call was both a relief and a source of new anxiety. The federal authorities her father had contacted were still active, but their investigation had obviously failed to prevent Gendyne from continuing their illegal experiments. Agent Martinez explained that the FBI had been gathering evidence for years, but they needed testimony from someone who had direct knowledge of the current experiments. "Dr. Jennings, we believe Gendyne is preparing to deploy their biological weapons on a larger scale, possibly as part of a terrorist attack or foreign military operation. Your father's research suggests that you may have developed countermeasures to their genetic modifications. Is that correct?" Marla glanced at the synthesis equipment humming quietly in her father's laboratory. "I'm completing his work now. The antidote should be ready within hours, but I'll need live subjects to test its effectiveness. We can provide protection while you complete your research, but we need your cooperation in gathering evidence that can be used in federal court." Gendyne's leadership includes individuals with connections to foreign governments and terrorist organizations. This isn't just about animal cruelty, it's about national security. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's urgent call from upstairs. Hope's condition had changed dramatically, and not for the better. When Marla reached the clinic, she found the puppy convulsing with seizures that were unlike anything she'd seen before. The crystalline growths along Hope's spine were pulsing rapidly, synchronized with a rhythm that seemed to be accelerating beyond the puppy's ability to maintain. "It's like she's receiving some kind of signal," Sarah observed, trying to comfort Hope while monitoring her vital signs. "The seizures started about 10 minutes ago, right after those helicopters passed overhead." Marla hadn't noticed the helicopters, but their presence explained the sudden change in Hope's condition. If Gendyne was using electromagnetic signals to control or monitor their genetically modified test subjects, proximity to transmission equipment could trigger severe reactions in affected animals. The other animals in the clinic were showing similar symptoms. The farm cat was pacing frantically in her kennel, and the stray dog was whimpering with distress that sounded almost human. All three animals were responding to something their human caretakers couldn't perceive, something that was causing them obvious pain and distress. "We need to complete the antidote synthesis now," Marla said, making the difficult decision to prioritize the cure over her patient's immediate comfort. "If Gendyne is activating some kind of control system, we may not have much time before the affected animals suffer permanent damage." The final steps of the synthesis process required Marla's complete attention. The antidote had to be maintained at exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, while 3 separate chemical compounds were added in precise sequence. A deviation of even 1 degree or a timing error of more than 30 seconds could render the entire batch useless, and there wasn't time to start over. Sarah took over monitoring the affected animals while Marla worked in the laboratory. But even through the basement walls, she could hear Hope's increasingly desperate whimpering. The puppy was fighting a battle that conventional veterinary medicine couldn't address, and her suffering was a constant reminder of what was at stake. As the final chemical reaction stabilized, Marla's phone rang again. This time, the caller was Mayor Bradley, and his tone carried a desperation that suggested the carefully maintained conspiracy was finally collapsing. "Dr. Jennings, I know you think you understand what's happening in our town, but you're in danger that goes beyond anything you can imagine. Gendyne isn't just a pharmaceutical company. They're connected to organizations that consider individual lives expendable in pursuit of their larger goals. If you continue this investigation, you won't just be putting yourself at risk. You'll be endangering everyone in Cedar Falls. The threat was more sophisticated than the crude intimidation attempts she'd experienced earlier. Bradley was trying to use her compassion against her, suggesting that her pursuit of justice would somehow harm the innocent people of Cedar Falls. But Marla had studied her father's research too thoroughly to be swayed by such manipulation. Mayor Bradley, my father documented Gendyne's experiments 15 years ago, and I've continued his work. The federal authorities are already aware of what's happening here, and the evidence we've gathered will be presented regardless of what happens to me. The only question now is whether you want to be remembered as someone who helped expose these crimes or as someone who enabled them. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute before Bradley responded. Dr. Jennings, you have no idea what forces you're challenging. Gendyne has resources and connections that reach far beyond Cedar Falls. They've invested too much in this project to let it be stopped by one idealistic veterinarian. As the call ended, Marla realized that the antidote synthesis was complete. The pale blue liquid in the reaction chamber represented 15 years of her father's work and the hope of healing for every animal that had suffered from Gendyne's experiments. But completing the synthesis was only the first step. Now she had to test its effectiveness and find a way to distribute it to the affected animals throughout Cedar Falls. The sound of helicopters returned, closer this time, and Hope's seizures intensified accordingly. Whatever signal Gendyne was transmitting, it was designed to cause maximum distress to their genetically modified test subjects. The cruelty was deliberate. They were using the animals, suffering as a weapon against anyone who tried to help them. But as Marla prepared the first dose of antidote, she felt a calm determination settle over her. Her father had died trying to expose Gendyne's crimes, and she wouldn't let his sacrifice be meaningless. The cure was ready, the evidence was documented, and federal agents were standing by to take action. The only thing standing between Gendyne and justice was her willingness to risk everything in the name of creatures who couldn't fight for themselves. The first injection of antidote into Hope's bloodstream produced results that exceeded even Marla's most optimistic expectations. Within minutes, the puppy's seizures stopped and her breathing normalized. The crystalline growths along her spine, which had been pulsing with agitated energy, began to dim and shrink as the synthetic compounds in her system were neutralized by her father's cure. "It's working," Sarah whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face as Hope lifted her head and looked around with clear, alert eyes for the first time since arriving at the clinic. But their celebration was cut short by the sound of vehicles approaching the clinic. Through the front windows, Marla could see a convoy of black SUVs surrounding the building, their occupants emerging with the coordinated precision of a military operation. These weren't local law enforcement officers. They were the same personnel Pete had observed at the Henderson farm, and their arrival meant that Gendyne had decided to take direct action to protect their secrets. Mayor Bradley's voice boomed through a megaphone from the parking lot. "Dr. Jennings, you are conducting illegal medical experiments without proper licensing or oversight. You need to surrender yourself and all research materials immediately for the safety of the community." The accusation was richly ironic, coming from someone who had spent 15 years covering up genuinely illegal experiments. But Marla recognized it as a carefully crafted justification for whatever Gendyne planned to do next. By framing her life-saving work as dangerous and illegal, they were creating a pretext for seizing her father's research and eliminating the threat she represented to their operations. "Sarah, I need you to take Hope and get to the basement laboratory," Marla said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Contact Agent Martinez and tell her what's happening here. The evidence package is in the safe. The combination is my father's birthday." Before Sarah could object, the clinic's front door exploded inward as Gene Dine's operatives breached the entrance with military-grade equipment. The men who entered weren't wearing police uniforms or identification badges. They were dressed in black tactical gear that concealed their faces and affiliations. "Where is the research?" the team leader demanded, his voice electronically distorted by a voice modifier. "We know you've been continuing Robert Jennings' work. Surrender all materials, and no one needs to be hurt." Marla stood her ground in the clinic's main examination room, positioning herself between the intruders and the basement entrance where Sarah was evacuating Hope. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a veterinary clinic, not a research facility." The team leader gestured to his companions, who began systematically searching the clinic while he kept Marla under guard. They moved with the efficiency of people who had conducted similar operations before, checking every cabinet, drawer, and storage area for evidence of her father's work. But their search was interrupted by the arrival of Cedar Falls residents who had been monitoring the situation from nearby buildings. Pete Morrison was the first to arrive, followed by Mrs. Chun from the grocery store, the Henderson family from the dairy farm, and dozens of other community members who had decided that enough was enough. "This is our town," Pete announced, his weathered face set with determination. "We don't know who you people are, but Dr. Jennings has been helping our animals when no one else could. You have no right to be here." The first injection of antidote into Hope's bloodstream produced results that exceeded even Marla's most optimistic expectations. Within minutes, the puppy's seizures stopped and her breathing normalized. The crystalline growths along her spine, which had been pulsing with agitated energy, began to dim and shrink as the synthetic compounds in her system were neutralized by her father's cure. "It's working," Sarah whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face as Hope lifted her head and looked around with clear, alert eyes for the first time since arriving at the clinic. But their celebration was cut short by the sound of vehicles approaching the clinic. Through the front windows, Marla could see a convoy of black SUVs surrounding the building, their occupants emerging with the coordinated precision of a military operation. These weren't local law enforcement officers. They were the same personnel Pete had observed at the Henderson farm, and their arrival meant that Gene Dine had decided to take direct action to protect their secrets. Mayor Bradley's voice boomed through a megaphone from the parking lot. "Dr. Jennings, you are conducting illegal medical experiments without proper licensing or oversight. You need to surrender yourself and all research materials immediately for the safety of the community." The accusation was richly ironic, coming from someone who had spent 15 years covering up genuinely illegal experiments. But Marla recognized it as a carefully crafted justification for whatever Gene Dine planned to do next. By framing her life-saving work as dangerous and illegal, they were creating a pretext for seizing her father's research and eliminating the threat she represented to their operations. "Sarah, I need you to take Hope and get to the basement laboratory," Marla said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Contact Agent Martinez and tell her what's happening here. The evidence package is in the safe. The combination is my father's birthday." Before Sarah could object, the clinic's front door exploded inward as Gene Dine's operatives breached the entrance with military-grade equipment. The men who entered weren't wearing police uniforms or identification badges. They were dressed in black tactical gear that concealed their faces and affiliations. "Where is the research?" the team leader demanded, his voice electronically distorted by a voice modifier. "We know you've been continuing Robert Jennings' work. Surrender all materials, and no one needs to be hurt." Marla stood her ground in the clinic's main examination room, positioning herself between the intruders and the basement entrance where Sarah was evacuating Hope. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a veterinary clinic, not a research facility." The team leader gestured to his companions, who began systematically searching the clinic while he kept Marla under guard. They moved with the efficiency of people who had conducted similar operations before, checking every cabinet, drawer, and storage area for evidence of her father's work. But their search was interrupted by the arrival of Cedar Falls residents who had been monitoring the situation from nearby buildings. Pete Morrison was the first to arrive, followed by Mrs. Chun from the grocery store, the Henderson family from the dairy farm, and dozens of other community members who had decided that enough was enough. "This is our town," Pete announced, his weathered face set with determination. "We don't know who you people are, but Dr. Jennings has been helping our animals when no one else could. You have no right to be here." The crowd that had gathered outside the clinic represented a cross-section of Cedar Falls society farmers, shopkeepers, retirees, and young families who had finally found the courage to stand up to the forces that had terrorized their community for 15 years. Many of them carried animals that showed signs of Genedine's genetic modifications, creating a living tableau of the suffering that had been hidden for too long. "Look at what they've done to our pets, our livestock," Mrs. Chum called out, holding up her affected cat for everyone to see. "Dr. Jennings is the first person who's been able to help them." The Genedine operatives found themselves facing something they hadn't expected, a community that was no longer willing to be intimidated into silence. The financial incentives that had bought compliance for 15 years meant nothing when people could see their beloved animals suffering from genetic modifications that served no legitimate medical purpose. As the standoff intensified, Marla heard the sound of helicopters approaching from the north. But these weren't the unmarked aircraft that had been transmitting control signals to the affected animals. These bore the distinctive markings of federal law enforcement. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through a loudspeaker from the lead helicopter. "This is the FBI. You are surrounded and ordered to surrender immediately. Drop your weapons and place your hands where we can see them." The Genedine team leader looked around at the crowd of angry townspeople, the approaching federal agents, and Marla's defiant stance, clearly calculating his options. Whatever Genedine had planned for Cedar Falls, it wasn't going according to their script. "This isn't over," he said, his distorted voice carrying a promise of future retaliation. "You have no idea what you've interfered with here." As the tactical team began their withdrawal, Marla realized that Sarah had successfully transmitted the evidence to federal authorities and that Hope's dramatic recovery had been witnessed by dozens of community members who could testify to the antidote's effectiveness. The conspiracy that had controlled Cedar Falls for 15 years was finally collapsing under the weight of truth and community courage. The federal agents who descended from the helicopters moved with the same professional efficiency as Genedine's operatives. But their authority was legitimate, and their purpose was transparent. Agent Martinez, a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling complex investigations, took immediate control of the situation. "Dr. Jennings, we received your transmission and have been monitoring Genedine's activities in this area for the past 72 hours. She said, her voice carrying both relief and urgency. "We have warrants for the arrest of Marcus Webb and his associates, along with authorization to seize all materials related to their illegal experimentation program." The Genedine operatives had retreated to their vehicles but hadn't yet departed, apparently waiting for instructions from their superiors. Mayor Bradley stood near his own car, his face pale as he realized that his 15-year conspiracy was about to be exposed to federal scrutiny. "Agent Martinez, there are at least 12 more Genedine personnel at the Henderson farm," Marla said, gesturing toward the property visible in the distance. "They've been operating a hidden laboratory there, and I believe they're preparing to deploy biological weapons on a larger scale. The agent nodded grimly. We're aware of the Henderson facility. Federal teams are moving to secure that location as we speak. But we need your testimony about the genetic modifications they've been performing and the effectiveness of your father's antidote. As if summoned by their conversation, Hope emerged from the clinic on unsteady legs, supported by Sarah, but clearly much stronger than she'd been just hours earlier. The puppy's transformation was remarkable. The crystalline growths had almost completely disappeared, and her coat was already beginning to show signs of healthy regrowth. The crowd of Cedar Falls residents gathered around Hope with wonder and relief, many of them seeing confirmation for the first time that their animal's suffering could actually be treated. Mrs. Chen knelt down to let her affected cat sniff Hope, and the interaction between the two animals seemed to provide comfort to both creatures. This is what Dr. Robert Jennings died trying to achieve, Pete announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of suppressed truth. He knew that Gene Dine was torturing animals for profit, and he developed a cure that could save them all. Agent Martinez began coordinating with her team to establish a secure perimeter around the clinic, while federal forensics experts prepared to document the evidence in Marla's father's laboratory. But their work was interrupted by the sound of explosions from the direction of the Henderson farm, followed by a pillar of black smoke rising into the afternoon sky. They're destroying the evidence, Agent Martinez said, speaking rapidly into her radio. All teams converge on the Henderson location immediately. Do not let them escape with any research materials. The next hour passed in a blur of federal activity as agents worked to secure the crime scene and arrest the conspirators who had terrorized Cedar Falls for so many years. Mayor Bradley was taken into custody, along with Sheriff Williams and several other local officials who had been on Gene Dine's payroll. The financial records that Sarah's father had provided proved invaluable in identifying the full scope of the corruption. But the most satisfying moment came when Dr. Marcus Webb himself was brought to the clinic in federal custody. The man who had orchestrated years of animal suffering looked small and defeated as he faced the community he had victimized and the animals he had tortured for profit. "Dr. Webb," Marla said, cradling Hope in her arms as the puppy dozed peacefully for the first time since arriving at the clinic, "I want you to see what my father's work accomplished. This puppy will recover completely from what you did to her, and so will every other animal you experimented on." Webb's response was predictable, a mixture of self-justification and contempt for what he called sentimental attachment to laboratory animals. But his words fell on deaf ears in a community that had finally seen the truth about his operations and had chosen to stand with those who fought for justice, rather than those who profited from suffering. As the afternoon wore on, more affected animals were brought to the clinic for treatment with the antidote. The synthesis equipment in her father's laboratory allowed Marla to produce enough cure for every known victim of Gene Dine's experiments, and each successful treatment strengthened the community's resolve to ensure that such cruelty would never be tolerated again. Agent Martinez pulled Marla aside as the initial crisis was winding down. "Dr. Jennings, your father's research and your courage in continuing his work have helped us break up an international network of biological weapons dealers. Gene Dine was planning to sell their genetic modification technology to terrorist organizations and hostile foreign governments. By stopping them here, you've potentially saved thousands of lives." The magnitude of what they had prevented was difficult to comprehend. But as Marla looked around at the community that had finally found its voice and the animals that were beginning to heal, she understood that the most important victory was the one that had happened right here in Cedar Falls. 6 months after the arrest that had shattered Gene Dine's conspiracy, Cedar Falls had transformed into something its residents had never imagined it could. Become a symbol of how ordinary people could triumph over corporate evil when they found the courage to stand together. The Dr. Robert and Marla Jennings Research Foundation occupied the renovated Gendyne facility. Its laboratories now dedicated to ethical veterinary research and the development of treatments for genetic disorders in animals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the building which had housed so much cruelty was now devoted to healing, but Marla felt it was a fitting tribute to her father's memory. Hope, now a healthy and energetic young dog, served as the foundation's unofficial mascot and therapy animal for other creatures recovering from genetic modifications. Her transformation from a suffering victim to a symbol of resilience had inspired donations from around the world, allowing the foundation to expand its mission beyond Cedar Falls to help animals affected by unethical experimentation anywhere. She remembers, Pete observed, watching Hope interact gently with a new arrival, a cat that had been found near a pharmaceutical facility in Ohio with similar genetic modifications. She knows what these other animals are going through, and she wants to help them heal. The legal proceedings that followed. Gendyne's exposure had been swift and comprehensive. Dr. Marcus Webb and his associates received federal sentences that would keep them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Mayor Bradley, Sheriff Williams, and other local conspirators faced their own lengthy prison terms for their roles in covering up the illegal experiments. The financial settlements from Gendyne's parent corporation had provided compensation for affected families throughout Cedar Falls and funding for ongoing research into genetic modification therapies. More importantly, the case had led to federal legislation strengthening protections for research animals and establishing severe penalties for corporations that violated ethical standards in their pursuit of profit. The Cedar Falls Act, as it came to be known, required unprecedented transparency in animal research and created federal oversight mechanisms that made future cover-ups virtually impossible. Sarah had enrolled in veterinary school at State University, her tuition funded by a scholarship established in Robert Jennings' honor. She planned to return to Cedar Falls after graduation to work at the foundation, bringing advanced training in genetic therapy to complement Marla's growing expertise in treating modification-related disorders. "Your father would be so proud," Sarah said during one of her visits home from school. "Not just of what you accomplished, but of how the whole community came together to fight for what was right." The community aspect of their victory was perhaps the most meaningful change of all. Cedar Falls had learned that keeping silent about injustice, even when offered financial incentives to do so, ultimately made everyone complicit in the suffering of innocence. The town's new motto, displayed on a memorial plaque in the clinic's waiting room, read, "Speak for those who cannot speak for themselves." Pete had been appointed as the foundation's community liaison, a role that seemed tailor-made for someone who had spent decades caring for animals that others had forgotten. His documentation of Gendyne's victims had proven invaluable in the federal investigation, and his courage in supporting Marla during the darkest moments of their struggle had earned him recognition as a hero in his own right. The clinic itself had been expanded and modernized with equipment that would have been unimaginable in the days when Marla had struggled to pay student loans and maintain Dr. Patterson's aging facility. But the heart of the practice remained the same, a place where animals received compassionate care from people who understood that every life had value, regardless of species. Congressional hearings had brought national attention to the case, with Marla testifying before committees investigating corporate corruption and biological weapons development. Her calm, factual presentation of the evidence had been more powerful than any dramatic courtroom speech, and her father's research had become the foundation for new federal policies governing genetic experimentation. The hearings had also revealed the international scope of Gendyne's operations, leading to arrests and investigations in dozens of countries where similar experiments had been conducted. The network of corruption that had seemed so overwhelming when confined to Cedar Falls turned out to be vulnerable once exposed to sustained scrutiny by law enforcement agencies around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from the veterinary community itself. The American Veterinary Medical Association had created the Robert Jennings Award for Ethical Research, presented annually to veterinarians who demonstrated exceptional courage in protecting animal welfare. Marla had been the first recipient, though she insisted that the award belonged to her father and the community that had supported their efforts. As she sat in her father's old study one evening, reviewing applications for the Foundation's research grants, Marla reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning when Pete had brought hope to her clinic. The frightened, suffering puppy that had started this journey was now sleeping peacefully at her feet, healthy and whole, and serving as inspiration for animals around the world who needed advocates willing to fight for their welfare. The leather-bound journal where her father had recorded his research was now displayed in the Foundation's library, open to the page where he had written, "Some discoveries are too important to abandon, even in the face of mortal danger." Below his words, Marla had added her own inscription, "And some fights are too important to lose, even when the odds seem impossible." Hope stirred in her sleep, her legs moving as if she were running through fields where she would never again fear human cruelty. In that peaceful movement, Marla saw the promise that her father's sacrifice had not been in vain, and that the future held hope for every creature that needed someone to speak for those who could not speak for themselves.